Let's break down 5 players to stash before week 6 of the fantasy season. These are players to add to your bench that could help you guys bring some upside to your overall roster as the fantasy season progresses. All right, let's start with Kendre Miller of the New Orleans Saints, who also made last week's video, coming off of a week 5 performance where he had just 5.9 fantasy points. But what I do want to point out here is that he still had 10 total touches, right? Week 4, we talked about him going into week 5 because he had 11 total touches. It looked pretty solid, 5.9 yards per carry, had a rushing touchdown, 65 yards on the ground against the Buffalo Bills. And really, while, he wasn't necessarily as effective in week 5, the overall volume was still there. Still had 10 total touches, a target, and a catch against the Giants last week, compared to Alvin Kamara, who had 8 touches on the ground, but still got the receiving work overall, 6 touches, 4 targets. But that's the other thing to talk about here. Alvin Kamara has been limited throughout the week, has also missed some practice due to an ankle injury. If we see Alvin Kamara miss any amount of time, Kendre Miller is the clear-cut RB1 on this team. It's not going to be rookie Devin Neal, who's played a total of 9% of snaps on the entire season. Just 2 rushing attempts in week 1 for Devin Neal. That is it. Kendre Miller is the running back to own in terms of a handcuff to Alvin Kamara. We saw Kamara miss time at the end of 2024 last year. We could very well see a veteran running back like Kamara miss time this year. We've already seen an increase in volume over the last 2 weeks to Kendre Miller. Not necessarily a great matchup this week against the New England Patriots. We know that. They've been very good against opposing running backs in terms of fantasy points allowed, but following week, great matchup against the Chicago Bears. Could also start to continue to see some standalone value out of Kendre Miller like we saw in week 4 of the season. So he sits around 37% rostered. With this Kamara injury news breaking, I do think that roster percentage will increase day by day as the week progresses. So go ahead, get him on your bench, stash Kendre Miller right now. All right, next up, let's talk about Kamani Vidal of the LA Chargers, sitting around 41% rostered. Didn't do a whole lot in week 5 against the Washington Commanders, and I don't think anyone necessarily expected him to, but that is the same game that we saw Omarion Hampton sustain an injury. He is now on IR, is going to miss at least 4 games. And I know Kamani Vidal has been talked about like in a lot of waiver videos here for week 6 of the season, as Hassan Haskins, who sits around 61% rostered. And I am kind of in the boat that Hassan Haskins is going to get the bulk of the touches here, is going to have the opportunity to act as the primary running back for the LA Chargers. But with Kamani Vidal being the lower roster player, I did want to talk about him for today's video because he does have a little bit of a different skill set than Hassan Haskins, more of a speed back, a receiving type back. We could see that type of role start to be carved out over the next couple of weeks. Remember, early in the season last year, in his rookie season, week 6 of the season, we saw him score a big receiving touchdown against the Denver Broncos. Then it was like, oh, is this breakout actually happening after he didn't play the first 5 weeks of the season? And then nothing really ever happened with that for the rest of the season, but he could bring that type of skill set to the table. We've seen a little flash, not a whole lot to go off of here, but once again, when you look at his collegiate profile, this is a running back who brings just a different skill set to the table than Hassan Haskins. And with Najee Harris already set to miss the entire season, Hampton being banged up, we could see the Chargers coaching staff start to kind of look to potentially more of a committee or situations where they utilize more than one running back, even when Omarion Hampton is back. Now, when Hampton is back and fully healthy, I fully expect him to be the clear-cut RB1, but that doesn't mean that they might not try to get involvement out of other running backs. And if Hampton's on the field, I think it actually makes more sense down the stretch for them to try and utilize Kamani Vidal if he's able to prove himself as a true pass-catching running back over the next 4 weeks of the season. So he's got a great opportunity here in week 6 against one of the worst run defenses in the NFL. In the Miami Dolphins, game script could also benefit the Chargers here, where maybe they do utilize a little bit more of Kamani Vidal as this game goes on and not just Hassan Haskins. So ultimately, I'm in the boat that I like Hassan Haskins a little bit more, but once again, with Vidal being the more lowly rostered players, if he's still out there on waivers, if he cleared waivers in your guys' league, might be a good idea to go ahead and stash him if you are thin at the running back position. All right, moving to the wide receiver position, let's talk about Kendrick Bourne of the San Francisco 49ers, who also made the waiver wire video for this week. But since this week's waivers have cleared, he's sitting between 38 and 40% rostered. And honestly, there's a pretty good chance here in week 6 of the season that we don't see Ricky Pearsall and or Jawan Jennings. Pearsall has still been missing practice throughout the week. Jawan Jennings has been limited the entire week in his return to practice. There's a chance one of these two players plays. There's a chance neither player plays, and I guess technically speaking, there's a chance both players play. But either way, there's a situation here in week 6 of the season where Kendrick Bourne is the primary wide receiver for the San Francisco 49ers. And we know George Kittle isn't going to be back this week, not even set to practice until next week. So when we look at the pass catchers on this team, we got Christian McCaffrey, Jake Tunges, who has played well in relief of George Kittle and actually has looked very good over the last 2 weeks. Then Kendrick Bourne, maybe Pearsall, maybe Jennings, who are both banged up. So it's another good situation for Kendrick Bourne, who ultimately had 11 targets, 10 catches, 142 receiving yards, and 24.2 fantasy points in week 5. Not the strongest matchup here in week 6 of the season, but once again, if he comes out here and is able to prove himself in week 6 of the season, this is a player as the season progresses who could just be walking into a role with the San Francisco 49ers as their wide receiver room has been depleted throughout the entirety of the season so far. So I really like the idea of going out and picking up Kendrick Bourne, even if you don't need to start him in week 6 of the season with how many injuries this team has sustained on the offenses here. If there's a player who's healthy and playing well, they could easily carve out a role for the entirety of the season. And I know Mac Jones isn't going to be the starting quarterback for the entirety of the season, but as long as Mac Jones is starting and Brock Purdy continues to miss time, Mac Jones, Kendrick Bourne have a very good chemistry overall, dating back to their days with the New England Patriots. But even if it's Brock Purdy, I still like Kendrick Bourne and his overall outlook for the season because we've just seen so many injuries to this Niners offense. And right now we're seeing the most injuries to their pass catchers. So if Kendrick Bourne is still out there on waivers, floating around, especially if you're thin at the wide receiver position, I think he is a great player to go ahead, pick up, and stash right now. And let's look a little deeper at the wide receiver position and talk about Ryan Flournoy of the Dallas Cowboys, who had 9 targets, 6 catches, 114 receiving yards in week 5, and 18.4 fantasy points. Now, what we need to look at first and foremost here is the Dallas Cowboys wide receiver room, which has also been a bit banged up over the past couple of weeks. CeeDee Lamb missed week 5. He's missed the last 3 weeks of the season, obviously, dealing with that ankle injury that he sustained in week 3. Obviously, George Pickens has been out there and healthy. Jake Ferguson at the tight end position has been absolutely balling out. But we also saw an injury to Kevontae Turpin, who has been missing practice throughout this week, which opened up a really big role for Ryan Flournoy this past week. And a lot of people were looking to Jalen Tolbert at the wide receiver position as he had 6 targets in week 4, 6 targets in week 3, but he had just 1 target this past week, and it was Flournoy who was able to step in and just really take over behind Pickens and Ferguson in terms of pass catchers on this Dallas Cowboys offense. So we go into week 6. If CeeDee Lamb is out and Kevontae Turpin continues to miss time, this is just going to continue in terms of the role that he was able to carve out last week. It's a much tougher matchup here in week 6 of the season as the Panthers have allowed the second fewest fantasy points to opposing wide receivers, but ultimately just the shape of this Cowboys team overall, the defense is so bad. They give up so many total points basically to every single position across the board that the offense has to keep their foot on the pedal all game long and put up points. They throw the football a ton, they run the football a ton, and ultimately that could continue to benefit a player like Ryan Flournoy, who you guys probably never heard of, who I had never really heard of before this past week. He's very lowly rostered right now. When you guys look on your waivers, if you're hurting at wide receiver, this is once again a wide receiver who's going to have the opportunity to carve out a role in an offense that puts up a lot of points, that throws the football a ton, that is dealing with issues in terms of injuries at the wide receiver position. So this could be one of those situations where he has like one catch next week, or it could be a situation where he continues to carve out a role, continues to get targets, and makes the most of it. So if you're hurting at wide receiver, keep a close eye on Ryan Flournoy. All right, in last week's video, we talked about Mason Taylor as our tight end selection, and I will say if he's still out there and available, I think he's a must-add player at the tight end position, sitting around 45% rosters. Absolutely dominated targets last week for the New York Jets and at 17.7 fantasy points. But with that being said, I want to talk about a different tight end for today's video. That is A.J. Barner of the Seattle Seahawks, who sits between 27 and 30% rostered at the time I'm recording this. He is coming off of a huge Week 5 performance, 24.3 fantasy points, 7 targets, 7 catches, 53 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns. He now has 4 touchdowns through the first 5 games of the season and 10 or more fantasy points in 3 out of the first 5 games of the season so far. Not the best matchup here in Week 6 against the Jacksonville Jaguars. This defense, absolutely nothing to sneeze at, but they just gave up a pretty good game to Travis Kelce on Monday Night Football. And Sam Darnold is looking A.J. Barner's way, and especially in the red zone. Like, he is actively looking for A.J. Barner. We know that Jackson Smith-Njigba is the clear-cut number 1 pass catcher on this team. He is going to get the bulk of the targets, and it's kind of hard to look at this past week, like in terms of trying to split the target share and everything, because this past week against the Buccaneers was just an absolute shootout. So, but when we look at things ultimately, Torrey Horton on the season, 14 targets. Cooper Kupp has 29, and then A.J. Barner has 16. So he's kind of somewhere in between Torrey Horton and Cooper Kupp. Not even going to mention JSN. I mean, he's a clear-cut number 1 with 43 total targets, basically getting almost 100% of the target share on this offense, but they are getting other players included in terms of the pass catchers. And A.J. Barner is just a valuable tight end right now. Very, very lowly rostered. He's the tight end 11 in full PPR, the tight end 5 and half PPR right now. So Sam Darnold has looked pretty sharp over the last couple of weeks from a real life football perspective. Last week looked absolutely lights out from both a real life and fantasy football perspective. And ultimately, A.J. Barner is just getting involved in this offense, especially in the red zone, and finding ways to score touchdowns. So if you guys are hurting at the tight end position, I think that A.J. Barner is up there in terms of one of the best overall tight ends for you guys to go ahead and add to your roster. Stash them right now. And there you guys have it. There are my 5 players to stash before Week 6 of the fantasy season. If you guys need anything whatsoever, have any fantasy football questions, be sure to drop me a comment down below. I'm answering all fantasy football questions in the comment section down below. And while you guys are down there, it does me a huge favor if you guys hit that like button and that subscribe button on the way out. Really helps out the channel tremendously. And when the videos and playlists pop up on the screen, make sure you guys go check out all of our Week 6 fantasy content. We have everything that you guys could possibly need to dominate this week and every coming week of the fantasy season. So with that, I'll say thank you guys so much for watching and or listening. And remember, you saw it here on The Catch.